day. Before I return to the usual topic of these videos, at least the usual topic over the last few months since February, I think I should say a little more about the situation in Serbia and Kosovo, which I did not touch on in my video yesterday. Briefly, the standoff there continues. There still seem to be accumulations of Serb troops on the border areas. They still seem to be ready to move into Kosovo, and Serbs within Kosovo have continued to keep their barricades up in the various places where some of them live. In addition, the authorities in Kosovo do not seem to have any intention of backing down from this face-off. In fact, they seem to have taken control of a regional parliament. I'm not quite sure what that parliament represents, and they seem to have essentially changed the political leadership of that parliament. In other words, the situation remains extremely tense. The possibility of a flare-up or of a crisis remains extremely high, but the Serb government, for the moment, seems to be treading very carefully. That's all I'm going to say about this very tense situation at the moment. I will obviously return to discuss it further when there is more news. With that, let us return to the actual war that is in fact going on at the moment, which is the war in Ukraine. And there's been more information about the fighting in Bakhmut, and this latest report seems to come from a Ukrainian source, which appears to confirm that the road from Bakhmut to the towns of Konstantinovka and Chasov Yar, these are two towns under Ukrainian control. This is one of the important roads through which supplies have been going to Bakhmut. Well, that road is apparently under Russian fire control. That means that the Russians do not, in fact, have troops who've actually cut the road, but that they're able to shell any trucks or vehicles or troops that try to move along it. And there's also been further information from Yevgeny Prigozhin, the founder or purported founder of the Wagner Group. I've expressed my skepticism about the extent to which he really is the founder of the Wagner Group, but never mind. He undoubtedly has an overall supervisory function over its activities. Anyway, Prigozhin says that fighting at Opytnoye is still ongoing, but he seems confident that the outcome of the fighting in this particular location is going very much in favor of the Russians, of the Wagner Group, and of the Russians overall. It's been pointed out, by the way, that Prigozhin has a habit of talking about battles or fights still being underway in particular locations, when in fact those locations have come under Russian control or the Wagner Group's control, and that Prigozhin doesn't like to confirm the capture of a particular location until Russian control of that location has been fully consolidated and any Ukrainian counterattacks have been repelled. So it could very well be that the Russians are in physical control of the whole of Opytnoye, but there are in fact multiple reports of major Ukrainian counterattacks. The Ukrainians are still trying to regain control of Opytnoye, but if so, all the reports suggest that those attempts are being repelled. Now, I want to stress again, these are reports from Prigozhin, from other Russian sources, from Ukrainian sources. I'm not able to confirm exactly what is going on in these places because obviously I am not there. But the general drift is clear, and in fact, there's further reports that the Russians are now in control of increasingly large areas of the residential parts of Bakhmut. So some of the fighting in Bakhmut, as well as this attempts to encircle Bakhmut from various sides, but some of it doesn't seem to involve actual street fighting within the town itself. And one does wonder what the situation exactly is like inside Bakhmut. I have to say that the resemblances to Stalingrad continue. Obviously, Stalingrad was in part an encirclement of the German forces who'd battled their way to Stalingrad, but it was also a battle within Stalingrad itself between the Soviet troops, the Red Army, and the Germans, who were still fighting over various locations inside Stalingrad, even as the greater battle around Stalingrad was proceeding. Anyway, that's a piece of history. I don't know how relevant it is to the actual fighting, but anyway, it does look as if alongside these encirclement operations, we have actual street fighting within the town itself. And when I speak about encirclement, I've talked about the extent to which the Russians seem to have fire control over all the main roads that lead into Bakhmut. This has been confirmed now, or spoken about, maybe not confirmed, but spoken about for several days. It is most likely true. We don't yet have a situation like we had in, say, Mariupol, where the Russians have established a tight ring around the town, where the town is in effect fully besieged. But again, I do wonder whether the trend of events isn't very much in that direction, that the Russians are steadily, incrementally gaining more and more of the places that they would need to control in order to complete that ring to besiege the town, or rather the Ukrainian defenders within the town. And I have to say, if that is indeed the case, then once more I ask myself, what is the logic of Ukraine's defense? I mean, why, after the example of what happened in Mariupol, where the Azov regiment and a Ukrainian naval infantry marine brigade both got trapped inside the town and were forced to surrender en masse, why are the Ukrainians seemingly intent on repeating the same process all over again in Bakhmut, in even more disastrous circumstances where they seem to be experiencing even more catastrophic losses? If it is indeed the case, as I discussed yesterday, that there is another one of these reputed arguments between General Zaluzhny and President Zelensky, with Zaluzhny trying to get Zelensky to agree to what eventually happened in Lysychansk, where at the last moment, before the trap fully closed, the Ukrainian troops who were defending Lysychansk were given an order to pull back, with the result that most of them did. Well, why, given that example, is Zelensky and the political leadership in Ukraine intent instead on repeating the example of Mariupol? It doesn't make any sense to me. And again, I do wonder and do ask what exactly is going on. Perhaps, and of course this is where my lack of knowledge of facts on the ground, perhaps it is related to some events on the ground which I don't understand. Perhaps the Ukrainians are trying to buy time in some way to sort of build up some more fortifications around Kramatorsk or such places. However, in that case, I have to say that I would have thought that a better strategy would not be to build fortifications, but to evacuate the troops from Bakhmut who might be able to defend those fortifications. But anyway, that's one thing. The other possibility, for all I know, is that a bit like what happened with Stalingrad, just as the German leadership, made a big play about how important Stalingrad was, spoke about that to the German people. The German leader, to his lasting regret, made a speech about the fact that Stalingrad was being taken under control at a time of the commemoration of his first attempt to seize power in the so-called Beer Hall Putsch of, I think, 1923. Anyway, maybe it could be that the Ukrainian leadership has perhaps somewhat unwisely been telling the Ukrainian people for a long time about the heroic defense of Bakhmut and how there's a great success in resisting the Russians there, and they can't quite bring themselves now to accept the loss of that town because they worry about the effect on morale if they did. Well, that may be one explanation. I mean, I don't know. But on the face of it, I find it very difficult to understand Ukrainian actions in Bakhmut. Anyway, that is what is going on in Bakhmut. There is information about what's going on in other places as well. And it does seem that in northern Donbass and Kharkiv region, the Ukrainians are now moving to the defensive, that the attempt to capture places like Svatovo and Kremenia and to break through into the Lugansk region, that has been abandoned. And there are reports that the Ukrainians are trying to set up, to build fortifications in that area in advance of some Russian offensive that they may be fearing. And in the south, Denis Pushilin, the head of the Donetsk People's Republic, has said that the Russians are now in control of 80% of Marinka. Fighting there continues to be very intense. The Ukrainian supply routes to Marinka have apparently also been largely cut, but the Ukrainians are still putting up resistance there. But Marinka seems to be very close to complete capture by the Russians after a battle that also looks like it has been extremely intense. And as I have discussed previously, Marinka and Vuhledar are connected to each other. It may not be the case, in fact, it probably is not the case, that this is a symbiotic connection between Marinka and Vuhledar. Probably the Ukrainians will want to hold out in Vuhledar, even if Marinka falls. But it does seem that if Marinka does eventually fall, which also looks inevitable, then at some point Vuhledar, the utility for Ukraine of clinging on to Vuhledar will start to reduce, and perhaps the ability to cling on to Vuhledar will reduce also. And last but not least, there's been more reports from Kherson region. Now, these are different reports from the ones I was talking about yesterday, and in fact over the previous few days in The Guardian, about how Ukrainian forces are supposedly operating on the east bank of the Dnieper River, something for which, as I've said already, I've seen no real evidence. It seems, on the contrary, that Kherson is essentially, the city of Kherson is essentially now a ghost town. Russian shelling of Kherson is continuous and relentless. Most of the civilian population has left. There's a humanitarian crisis emerging for those who are still there, as the Russian authorities have, by the way, pointed out. There's even some report that a few refugees from Kherson city have somehow managed to cross the Dnieper, perhaps in boats or whatever, and come over to the Russian side and are saying how bad the situation is there. And I read an article in somewhere in the British media, I forget which outlet, by the way, which essentially admitted this and said that the much longed for liberation of Kherson city has turned into something of a nightmare, with the situation in Kherson city essentially out of control. The Ukrainians have not been able to consolidate proper control of the place. Anyway, whilst Kherson city is under Russian shelling, yesterday, and perhaps today as well, Donetsk city has come under what the Russians claim is the heaviest shelling from the Ukrainian forces ever since the 2014 fighting. Now, this claim has been made by the Russians many times, and I don't know whether or not this is true. But anyway, the report is that the Ukrainians launched large volleys of rockets from 122mm multiple rocket launch systems. These are not HIMARS systems. These are adaptations of the Soviet era 122mm Grad system. But I've seen a report on a Russian channel that the launch was carried out using a Slovak adaptation of the Grad system, a much more advanced development of the Grad system. It remains unguided, but it can reload much faster than the classical Grad system of the 1960s. And it is this that has enabled the Ukrainians to launch this big volley of missiles at Donetsk. Well, it has been a consistent pattern throughout this war that when Ukraine finds itself under severe stress on parts of the battlefield, it responds by launching strikes at Donetsk city. And this is partly, I think, intended to distract the Russians, partly intended to keep people in Donetsk aware that Ukraine is still fighting, that it's still there on the doorstep of Donetsk. And I think it's partly also intended to get the Russians to divert resources from battles in other places, like, say, Bakhmut, and focus them instead on trying to repel these missile strikes, these rocket strikes, I should say, on Donetsk. Anyway, the Russians have, on occasions, shown a certain tendency to let themselves be diverted in that sort of way, but I doubt, with Surovikin clearly in charge and clearly setting out his objectives, I doubt that will be the case this time. Anyway, that's where we are on the battlefronts. That's the state of things at the moment. Maybe not dramatic advances in any particular location or place, but the grinding machine that General Surovikin has unleashed on the Ukrainians seems to be in full operation in Bakhmut. And there was a rather depressing article, well, depressing from a Ukrainian point of view, in Bloomberg, which also spoke about Ukraine's exhausted army and suggested that if the Russians are minded to keep the war going, if Putin keeps the war going through the winter, then the Russians will achieve victory in this war, with some hints there of a Ukrainian collapse in the spring. Well, that was in Bloomberg. Now, having said that, that leads us to other things. We've had comments now from the British Ministry of Defence, the head of the British Army, and also from the Pentagon, about the Russians being supposedly on the brink of running out of ammunition. of rockets, of missiles, of all sorts of things, and also of artillery shells. Now, I have to say, I've been tracking comments by Russian officials. They don't seem to me to be talking or acting or behaving as if that is in fact the case. On the contrary, Dmitry Peskov, Putin's spokesman, has just ruled out categorically any New Year ceasefire, which does not suggest to me a Russian leadership which believes that it's running out of anything very much. And in fact, the Financial Times, when it covered this article, provided some figures. Now, I don't know how accurate these figures are, but it said that Russia started the war with a stockpile of 17 million rounds of ammunition, 17 million. That it's run through 10 million, which would mean, logically, that it still had 7 million rounds of ammunition left. Now, those figures may be right, they may be wrong, they may be completely invented, but I'm going to make just a few observations about that. If that is correct, if that is indeed so, if the Russians have indeed fired 10 million rounds of ammunition over the course of this war, then that, by my very crude calculations, comes to something like 37,000 rounds of artillery ammunition launched by the Russians every day. Now, that is a staggering quantity of ammunition, and it does give us some sense, perhaps, of the volumes of artillery that the Russians have been using in this war. But are they really running out of ammunition? Well, of course, this is all based on the stockpile. There's now admissions from the British Defence Ministry, Pentagon as well, that the Russians are indeed able to produce weapons, though it's disputed how much the quantity of those weapons is. But anyway, is it indeed the case that the Russians are in fact running out of ammunition? Now, Russia has fought many wars in its history, went through the Second World War, went through the First World War. It's fought, as I said, many wars at many times. I can't, off the top of my head, remember a single one in which the Russians lost the war because they ran out of ammunition. This has never been an issue previously, so far as I am aware, at any point in Russian history, and I wonder why people persist in thinking that it will be a problem this time. Well, possibly it is because, as Brian Beletic has discussed at such extraordinary length and so thoroughly and clearly in his various videos for the new Atlas, it is because, in fact, it is the West that is running out of ammunition and weapon systems and machines and other things that they can provide to Ukraine. And now we're seeing more and more reports about this. We see Western political leaders talking about it. We've seen that the EU leadership is complaining about this, the fact that weapon stocks have become dangerously depleted on the part of many EU countries. Apparently France has had to stop supplying weapons to Ukraine because its weapon stocks have become so depleted. Britain is apparently struggling. The United States can keep going for the moment, but there are problems accumulating there as well. Brian Beletic, again, is the person to go to for discussions of all of that. And perhaps the most interesting sign for me of how bad things are becoming are reports that Ukraine, or rather its Western sponsors, have had to turn to places like Sudan and Morocco for, in the first case, ammunition, Soviet caliber ammunition for Ukraine's guns, and in the second case, that's the same Morocco, for spare parts and additional units of T-72 tanks, the kind that Ukraine is using as well. Now, I have to say, if one is reduced to scrabbling around for weapons like that in those kind of places, well, it doesn't look good at all. But there we go. That is the actual situation. As I said, let me repeat again. I've been tracking very carefully comments, statements from Russian officials. I don't get the sense that they feel as if their army is running out of anything very much. In fact, yesterday there was another big strike, drone strike across Ukraine. Lots of drones attacked Kiev. The Ukrainians claimed that they shot down all of them, 13 allegedly. Again, it's difficult to say whether that is the case or not. There's been lots of smoke coming, seen over the horizon of Kiev, which does rather suggest that some of these drones did in fact get through. But again, on the subject of that, it seems that Ukraine, in order to shoot down some of these drones, used some of its new Western surface-to-air missiles. If this is correct, well, the cost of those missiles set against the very low cost of these drones made with fiberglass, using simple engines and that kind of thing, suggests that this is not a good trade. And of course, we've been hearing reports that Ukraine is running out of surface-to-air missiles. So perhaps that's a further sign that the problems of supply are more on the Ukrainian than on the Russian side. And of course, we have the problems in Kherson city that I talked about. There's a continued crisis with energy supplies in Odessa. The city seems to be completely without power and has now been so for many days, with no real end to this problem in sight. I've noticed that the media in the West isn't talking about or discussing this story, which seems astonishing. And of course, we've also heard reports that 50% now of the Ukrainian energy system is out of order. So we have, on the contrary, all the indications suggest that the Russians are quietly confident about the position. They don't seem, as I said, to show any signs of stress about ammunition issues or such things, whereas all the problems, on the contrary, in this kind of area seem to be on the Western side. And of course, coming back to that topic which I discussed at such length in my video yesterday, we have the West scrabbling around to find surface-to-air missiles to send to Ukraine. Now, I'm going to add a few points made by Scott Ritter, who has a much clearer grasp and understanding of these kind of things than I do about the Patriot missile deliveries to Ukraine. And he's made 2 points in various programs which I've seen. The first is that it looks as if the Patriot missile battery that is going to be supplied to Ukraine, and it looks as if it will probably be only one, is going to be drawn from the National Guard stocks rather than the serving army stocks. Well, if that's right, then one battery, even with the multiple launches that it has, is not realistically going to make a huge difference. The second point that he made is that this system, this Patriot battery, is incompatible with Ukraine's air defense system, which is, of course, constructed around Soviet radars, Soviet control systems, It's a comprehensive air defense system. You can't attach Western systems to it. Any attempt to do so are more likely to disorganize and weaken the system and fragment it rather than strengthen it. And I have no reason to doubt that is true. That makes complete sense to me. If this report is correct, that the United States is indeed planning to send a Patriot missile battery to Ukraine and apparently persuade Germany to send another, so that would make 2 in total, then this looks more like tokenism than any real attempt to change the situation on the battlefields in Ukraine. And of course, it'd be very interesting to see where these systems are deployed. If they're deployed in Western Ukraine, for example, rather than in the east or the center of the country, then that will reinforce what I suspect is already a gathering view, that the Western powers are starting to lose any real confidence that the war in the eastern regions of Ukraine, where it is actually being fought, well, that the Russian advance in that area can realistically be stemmed, and that this would look more like an attempt to sort of project some kind of shield, in air defense shield, in the western areas of Ukraine, possibly in an anticipation of the dispatch of NATO troops at some point into that area. That's a big topic. I'm not going to discuss it in this program. But anyway, we will see exactly what this Patriot delivery actually amounts to. I should say that as of this morning, but it's early in Washington, so when I'm making this video, but as of this morning, there's been no formal announcement about this in Washington, though no doubt there will be fairly soon. Anyway, there we go. So, very bad, very difficult situation in Ukraine, very difficult military situation. It does now seem as if instead of advancing anywhere, the Ukraine seems to be at a complete standstill. It's been pushed onto the defensive. The Kherson offensive has turned into a bitter disappointment. The capture of Kherson city has ended up landing Ukraine with an insuperable problem rather than being a great liberation victory. And the Kharkiv offensive, well, in that area, the Ukrainians seem to be preparing to go on the defensive. And of course, in Bakhmut, it is the Russians who continue to grind Ukraine down. So, what are we going to see over the next few weeks and months? Extraordinarily, some people in the West seem to be still clinging to the idea that the Russians that have announced that there will not be a press conference from Putin this year. I've even read an article by Con Coughlin in the Daily Telegraph, who seems to think that this indicates that that the Russians are on the brink of total surrender in Ukraine. Now, I have to say, I find that an incomprehensible thing, and I can only assume that Con Coughlin and the British media that are reporting this haven't read the TASS reports about this, which show that the press conference and the address to the National Assembly, the Federal Assembly, Russia's parliament, the two houses of Russia's parliament, that they've just been postponed for a few weeks to 2023. And here I'm going to say that there's been some further clarification about this. The Russians have said that work on this address, President Putin's address to the Federal Assembly, is still ongoing. That this is a massive work in progress because all kinds of things are being prepared and that there's a lot more coming. And this is the reason why both the press conference and the address to the Federal Assembly have had to be postponed. It's simply not possible to complete work on preparing this address to the Federal Assembly before the new year. I don't see any reason to challenge this. After all, this has been an incredibly complex year. Things are changing dramatically, both in Russia and the world. There's going to be a huge, significant reorientation of Russian economic policy as well as its foreign policy. Putin, by the way, is about to have a meeting with his top officials to discuss Russian development programs. So, I mean, economic development programs. I would have thought that would be an important topic to discuss when the Federal Assembly convenes and Putin makes his address. So it seems to me entirely unsurprising that the timetable has had to be shifted back a couple of weeks. And I really do think people in the West should be a little bit more measured in trying to interpret these things. And I have to say that all this talk about the Russians running out of ammunition, when by Western accounts, and these are Western accounts, I'm not sure that they're true, by the way, but Western accounts are putting Russian expenditure of ammunition at 37,000 rounds a day. And when the situation of the Ukrainian military in Bakhmut is looking increasingly critical, and when Bloomberg talks about Ukraine's army being exhausted, and of course the Daily Telegraph talked about it being tired short time ago. Well, given all of this, it does seem to me that all this talk about the Russians running out of steam, running out of ammunition, we heard that before, by the way, we heard that in the summer. We've heard this on regular occasions. Whenever we hear this, then it seems to me that events prove it wrong, and it really does look like a case of wishful thinking. Bear in mind that far from the Russians running out of steam, we seem to be getting ever more information of an ever-growing Russian build-up. Hundreds of thousands of reservists called up. The British Ministry of Defence now admits that some of them are being deployed to Belarus. It says that it doesn't expect these to be enough to break through Ukrainian defences there. That's probably true. It's been my view as well. I'm not sure that that is their purpose. But anyway, big build-up by the Russian military on every front in the war. Large deployments of tanks, artillery now. We're seeing lots of pictures of T-90 tanks. These are the latest tanks the Russians have. Apparently there's more and more of them now appearing on the battlefields, mostly new production, or so it is said. Well, and talking in this way about the Russians running out of steam, to me, frankly, given that this has been said so many times, it looks like wishful thinking. It looks like an attempt to keep everybody online, continuing in their commitment to Ukraine, even as the situation there goes from bad to worse. When all this talk was taking place about the Russians running out of steam back in the summer, well, you could see some grounds for it. Ukraine's mobilization was with full gear. The Ukrainian army was building up in size. Western weapons were pouring in. The Russian contract troops were going back into civilian life when their contracts were running out. But even then, even though that provided the basis for these Ukrainian counteroffensives in the autumn, as I've said, those counteroffensives, far from strengthening Ukraine's position overall, seem, according to Western reports to have left the Ukrainian army tired and exhausted. Given that this is so, given that all the talk of the Russians running out of steam in the summer turned out to be wrong, and of course that was in itself something that had been talked about and discussed previously. I've been reading reports about how the Russians were running out of missiles, running out of rockets, running out of aircraft all the way back in March. Well, given that this is so, does it make any sense to continue to indulge in this trope? Is it not a case of wishful thinking, leading Western policymakers into decisions which they might eventually come to regret? There's a view which I've seen expressed in the Asian media that Western leaders, European leaders, some European leaders quietly regret the fact, for example, that they launched the sanctions war against Russia to the extent that they did back in February, that they had not anticipated when they did launch it, that the Russian economy would prove as resilient as it did, and that the damage to their own economies would be as severe as it has turned out to be, and that they regret having made some of the decisions that they made then. I'm not sure who these Western leaders are, but Olaf Scholz and Emmanuel Macron must be two possibilities. Well, if that is the case, is it not unwise to fool those leaders even further by telling them stories about the Russians running out of equipment, running out of machines, running out of shells, even as the situation on the battlefields tells a different story, shows evidence of a big Russian buildup, of Ukrainian forces in Bakhmut suffering very severe losses, of the Ukrainians being forced onto the defensive in northern Donbass and in Kharkiv region, of the Russians building up their forces in Belarus and who knows, in all sorts of other places as well. I would add that over the last few weeks, on the topic of the Russians running out of weapons, I've heard of the Russian military receiving further batches of fighter jets, Sukhoi 34, 35, and Sukhoi 30 fighter jets. Don't know the numbers, but apparently some batches of these fighter jets have been delivered. And of course, the Russian Defense Ministry put in an order for more Zircon hypersonic anti-ship missiles, which also, by the way, have a land attack role. So why continue to fantasize or guess about Russian ammunition shortages and Russia running out of steam when the situation on the battlefields, and indeed, as I discussed before, historical precedent, Russia's ability to keep its weapons producing and being used in previous wars? Why indulge in this fantasy and disregard both what's going on the actual battlefields and what history says? Well, I have to say, it does seem to me increasingly now as if Western leaders are struggling to come up with coherent plans. Even as I speak, it seems that the European Union is still struggling to put together its 9th sanctions package. What is the point of a 9th sanctions package against Russia? There have already been 8. They've not achieved the outcome they were expected to achieve. So why come up with a 9th one? Apparently, It's going to be principally about sanctioning some Russian individuals, sanctioning 3 Russian television companies. What is that going to do? Sanctioning 3 more Russian banks. Well, what is that going to do either? It's not clear by now that the rest of the world isn't paying any attention. India is buying Russian oil. It's disregarding the oil price cap. China is doing the same. Other countries are doing the same. Erdogan and Putin have just had a further telephone call. They're talking about energy cooperation. They're talking about the grain deal and the release of Russian fertilizer exports and all of those things. And we have European leaders talking about a cap on prices of Russian gas. How much Russian gas is the European Union importing? Well, the short answer is quite a lot, actually. Pipeline gas to Europe has essentially stopped, but as it turns out, Europe has been importing quite a lot of LNG. Russian LNG. Russian LNG has apparently made up something like 16% of Europe's LNG imports. In which case, what is imposing a price cap on that LNG going to do? Well, it's going to mean that the Russians will stop exporting LNG to Europe. And what will the effect of that be? Less LNG in Europe from Russia, more LNG being sent to China and such places. China is opening up. It's going to be needing more gas. It's going to be importing probably more LNG from the Russians, just as it's importing more oil from the Russians, as it gears up its economy for a period of more expansive growth. But it's highly likely that the Chinese and perhaps the Indians and who knows, maybe all sorts of others will want to re-export some of that LNG that they're going to be buying from the Russians to Europe. But of course, they will be doing so at a mark-up. So it's only likely to make the cost of gas and energy in Europe higher than lower. Seems there are some countries in Europe that oppose the price cap, the gas price cap idea, but others that are insisting on it, and this is protracting and complicating the negotiations over this 9th sanctions package. And there is, of course, always and invariably now bitter arguments between the hardliners, the Baltic states, whose economies, by the way, seem to be under extreme stress, but who are so ideologically obsessed and so viscerally hostile to Russia that they still want even more sanctions, even though the sanctions war is taking a severe toll on them, much more severe than the Russian economy is experiencing. Anyway, it seems that they want a harsher sanctions package than is being proposed, even as other countries within the Union, the European Union, want a softer sanctions package. And what about the state of the Russian economy? Well, there was a long piece about it in the Financial Times, and it grudgingly admitted the truth that the Russian economy hasn't collapsed, that there hasn't been a severe recession. It said that there would be GDP contraction of between 3 and 4%. The Russian officials have been talking about a smaller GDP contraction than that. They've been saying that it will be less than 3%. I don't know who's right. I suspect the Russians are, but we'll just have to wait and see. Anyway, the Russian economy, the Financial Times accepts, has not collapsed. And Russia has run a budget deficit this year of 2% of GDP, which it has had no difficulty covering by issuing bonds on its domestic financial market. And it's, in fact, looking just possible that that budget deficit might actually fall. It might be slightly less than that this year because of recent increase in oil prices and energy prices, which could mean that the Russians are going to be able to lower that deficit, though, I'm not making any predictions there. It could turn out higher or lower, but 2% of GDP looks like what it's going to be. So, that's something the Financial Times has admitted, but don't worry, because the Russian economy is gradually degrading. It's running out of high technology. Import substitution is proving difficult in some area sectors, high technology sectors especially, and the result is that over time, in 5 years, in 10 years, in 15, 20 years, who knows how long, eventually the Russians will have an obsolete, out-of-date industrial base, as opposed to the marvelous, new, advanced technological industrial base of the West. But is that even true? One of the most interesting things about that Financial Times article is that I read it carefully. Maybe I missed this, but I couldn't actually see that these rather bold claims about the future technological decrepitude of the Russian economy were being made by scientists, engineers, technologists. There was an awful lot of reporting from smugglers and oligarchs and economists and commentators and that sort of thing. Sort of people who really you would expect to discuss that kind of question. The kind of people who work in these fields. Well, there seemed to be, if not a total absence, at least, shall we say, a surprising dearth of discussion from people like this. And I say that because I've just received from the person who wrote a brilliant email to me a short while ago, who is actually an engineer, who works in precisely this field, the field of microchips. He sent me a wonderful email, which I discussed in some programs, in one of the programs I did. Didn't get it entirely right, by the way, because I got some of the words wrong, but take that from me, that's my fault. It's absolutely not his. But anyway, this person has now followed up that email by providing me with a comprehensive and very useful and interesting paper explaining why this whole idea that the Russians are going to run out of technology is simply wrong. And I've also read a long piece by another Indian economist. It's a public article, which essentially says the same thing, but does so and looks at the whole state of the Russian economy and says that the economy, the economic structure of Russia is being massively misunderstood and underestimated in the West, and that the Russians ultimately will be able to get through and get through fine. And besides, is it even true that in the past the Russians, even in the Soviet era, were really that far behind in technological terms? I know that this is a common trope. People always say that. But is it actually the case? Well, it seems to me that maybe the Russians were behind in some areas, but they were pretty strong in others. And overall, if we look at the Soviet Union, it had many problems, and parts of its industrial base were pretty rickety. But something I can say as somebody who used to work in that field, that's to say industrial and logistical matters, I actually visited factories in the West, and a lot of them looked pretty rickety to me. Sometimes they used machine tools which were decades old. I think people always underestimate the extent to which industrial economies require a constant state of investment in order to keep themselves updated. And as we know, investment rates in the West have been very low, and investment rates in Asia have been very high, and investment rates in Russia were very low in the 1990s. In fact, they basically collapsed. And then under Putin, in the first decade of his rule, they were still quite low, but they've been steadily inching upward, and I get the sense that they're going to inch further upward still. And of course, the Russians are going to prioritize certain areas. I spoke about Putin, the fact that Putin is going to have a meeting with his economic people to look at specific technological sectors of the Russian economy. It has never seemed to me to be the case, in summary, that the Russians are technologically backward to anything like the extent that the West says. They always imagine that they are. Napoleon was astonished when he invaded Russia to discover that Russian artillery was more advanced than his own, and he was an artillery officer. The Germans, when they invaded Russia in the 1940s, were astonished to find that Russian tanks were better than their own. The Americans were astonished in the 1950s to see that the Russians were launching satellites and men into space before they did. And of course, we've seen the surprise in the West over the last few months of the fact that the Russians have been able to go on lobbing missiles, precision-guided missiles at Ukraine in quantities that the West never imagined that they had. So this whole trope about Russian technological backwardness seems to me to be a dangerous one, and it seems to me that it's been conjured up again in order to somehow obscure the fact that the sanctions which were imposed on Russia back in February have failed to have the effect predicted. I'm not even going to discuss the other thing, at least not in any detail, which of course has changed. Once upon a time, the West could claim to be the center of technological civilization. But of course today, technological knowledge is far more dispersed around the world than it used to be. And with countries like China and India becoming Russia's major trading partners, it's most unlikely that the Russians are going to run out of any important technological goods. Anyway, there we are. It seems that the West is now, as I said, still engaging in wishful thinking. The Russians are going to run out of steam in Ukraine before long, and that the West is still pressing on with an economic war which has failed to deliver on what the West expected, but which it can't bring itself to reverse. Well, we're almost up to the hour. As I said, I tried to the best extent that I can to limit my programs to an hour, and I hope this has been an interesting program. Obviously, the situation in Serbia and the Balkans is continued to be very tense, and no doubt there'll be more from me about that. And of course, the Bakhmut, the battle for Bakhmut, the battle in Donbass, the greater battle for Donbass continues, and there'll no doubt be an update from me about that in my next program. Thank you for joining me in the meantime today. As I said, more from me soon. Remember, you can find all our videos, mine, Alex Christophorou's, the Duran's videos on our other platforms, Locals, Rumble, ODYSEE, BitChute, Rockfin, and Telegram. And you can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. You should also check out our shop, where you can find all sorts of great things like our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, and all the rest. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. So that's me for the day. More from me soon.